It started the summer after my father died. We'd always been a small farming family living on the outskirts of a sleepy town no one ever talked about. The kind of place where people kept to themselves, in secret stayed buried with the seasons. My father had run the farm for as long as I could remember. Every morning before dawn, he'd be out there in the fields, tending to the crops, mending fences, or fixing up the barn. He was a man of the earth, never complaining about the long hours or the backbreaking work. After he passed, the farm fell to me. I did my best to keep things going, though I was nowhere near the man my father had been. It was just me and my mother now. She was frail, sickly. It had been a long time since she could help around the house, let alone the farm. So I did what I could, though each day felt heavier than the last. Our fields stretched far and wide, a sea of corn that swayed with the wind like golden waves. At the far edge of the property, just before the line of dark woods, was the Scarecrow. It had been there for as long as I could remember. Old, faded, and weather-beaten, it stood watch over the fields. It had an air of sadness about it, slouched forward as if the weight of the years had become too much. My father had made it when I was a boy, burlap sack for a head, stuffed with straw, with 2 black buttons sewn on for eyes. A thick rope stitched its mouth shut, and its arms were outstretched on a wooden cross, dressed in one of my father's old flannel shirts, now torn and sun-bleached. I never thought much about it. Just a scarecrow, nothing more. But after Dad was gone, strange things began happening on the farm. It started small, little things at first, things I could brush off or explain away. I'd leave my tools in the barn, only to find them scattered in the field the next day. Fences I'd mended the night before would be torn apart by morning, boards pulled clean out of the ground. Sometimes I'd hear strange noises at night, creaking, like something heavy shifting in the dark, or the faint rustle of corn stalks when there wasn't a breeze. Then the footsteps started. One night I was lying in bed, the windows open to let in the cool night air. The farm was quiet, the only sound the distant rustling of the corn. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunching of gravel, like someone walking just outside. My eyes shot open and I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound grew closer, each step heavier than the last before stopping just below my window. I sat up, throat dry, waiting for something, anything. But after a few agonizing moments, it stopped. Just silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Farm life was full of critters after dark after all. But the next night the footsteps came again, and this time they didn't stop. I shot up and rushed to the window, peering out into the yard, but there was nothing. The moonlight cast long shadows across the field, and everything was still. No footsteps, no sign of anyone or anything. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I saw it. I'd been waiting, sitting by the window with a flashlight clutched in my hand. The house was dead silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Just after midnight, the footsteps came, slow, deliberate, crunching across the gravel once again. My heart raced, and I flicked on the flashlight, casting the beam toward the yard. There, standing at the edge of the field, was the Scarecrow. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The Scarecrow was supposed to be at the far end of the field, propped up on its post, but now it stood in the yard, hunched forward like it was studying me. Its button eyes gleamed in the light, reflecting back at me, and for a moment I thought they moved. Just slightly, as if following the beam of light. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. This had to be a trick of the light. Maybe a prank. Kids from town messing with me. I stared at the Scarecrow for what felt like hours, waiting for it to move, to do something. But it just stood there, motionless, its ragged clothes flapping in the faint breeze. The next morning, the Scarecrow was back on its post, slouched as always, the wooden cross swaying in the wind. I checked the yard, but there were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I was just tired. Grief messes with your mind. But every night the footsteps returned, and every night the Scarecrow would be a little closer. First at the edge of the field, then halfway to the house. It never moved when I was watching, but each morning it was back on its post, like nothing had ever happened. The animals were the first to sense it. The cows refused to leave the barn, huddling in the far corner, their eyes wide and frightened. The chickens stopped laying eggs, and more than a few were found dead in their coop, their necks twisted at odd angles, their beady eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Even the crops began to wither, despite my best efforts. The soil felt wrong beneath my feet, cold and damp even in the heat of summer. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into the work, hoping that if I kept busy, I could forget about the scarecrow and the footsteps. But it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was watching me, always watching, waiting for something. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see it standing there, just out of sight. One evening, as I was finishing up the chores, I glanced toward the edge of the field. The scarecrow was there again, but it had moved closer, its arms hanging limply at its sides. The post it had once been tied to stood empty behind it, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach dropped. I approached cautiously, heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed something was wrong with its face. The burlap was sagging, the stitches pulling tight, as if something inside was stretching the fabric. The button eyes seemed darker, gleaming with a malicious glint that hadn't been there before. And its mouth, oh God, its mouth. The rope stitching had loosened, the threads fraying, and beneath them, something wet and dark gleamed in the faint light of the setting sun. I turned to run, but the sound of rustling stopped me in my tracks. I turned back and froze in horror. The scarecrow had taken a step forward. The ground beneath my feet felt like it was sinking, the soil wet and soft, pulling me down with every breath. I could hear the corn rustling, louder now, like something moving through the stalks. A whispering, soft but persistent, carried on the wind. "You belong to the field." I ran back to the house, heart hammering in my chest, locking every door and window. The footsteps followed me, growing louder, closer. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the shotgun in my lap, staring out the window, waiting for the scarecrow to appear. At dawn, I ventured outside. The air was thick with fog, the world eerily quiet. I half expected to find the scarecrow standing at my door, but the yard was empty. The only sign of life was the long shadow it cast from the far end of the field, where it had returned to its post. I thought about leaving, packing up and abandoning the farm, but I couldn't. Every time I tried to drive down the old dirt road, the engine would stall, or I'd feel a pull, like the very land was holding me in place, refusing to let me go. And every night, the scarecrow moved closer. First, it was at the field's edge, then the middle of the yard. Each time, a little closer. Each time, that sick, twisted smile on its burlap face grew wider, the stitches tearing more and more, until I swore I could see teeth, human teeth, beneath the burlap. Tonight, it's standing right outside my window, its button eyes pressed against the glass, the stitched grin stretched wide across its face. I can hear it whispering again, louder this time. "You belong to the field. I think I understand now. The farm, it's not just land. It's alive and it's hungry. My father must have known. He must have made a deal with it long ago, a pact to keep the crops growing, to keep the land thriving. And now with him gone, it's come for me." The scarecrow was never just a scarecrow. It was a guardian, a warning. But now it's too late. I can feel it, the pull of the field. The ground beneath me is soft, wet, and sinking. I can't leave. I belong to the field now, and soon I'll be the one watching.